Welcome. In 2015, the white supremacist massacre in Charleston, South Carolina, resulted in authorities taking down 11 Confederate monuments in cities across the South. Nearly 30 Confederate monuments were dismantled in reaction to events in Charlottesville in 2017, and nearly 100 Confederate monuments either were toppled by protesters or removed by authorities after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. Yet not a single one of these monuments has been permanently, irrevocably removed from view. Many were quickly reinstalled in other slightly less prominent locations like cemeteries, and others remain in storage until relocation decisions can be made. John Jay College's Center for Gender Justice, its student newspaper, the John Jay Sentinel, and its Black Students Union have invited Callie Holloway to discuss what these events mean. Holloway is a columnist for The Nation, senior director of the Make It Right project, and co-curator of the Theater of the Resist at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we are thrilled to welcome her. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, just to start out, did you know what you wanted to be when you were in college?
I did not, and I think I love to, when I get this question, particularly from a young person, to tell them that they don't need to feel the need to know what they need to do or what their career plan is going to be or exactly what their path's going to be. I was very arty in high school. I spent a lot of time in the art department. I was very into writing, so I spent a lot of time in my English classes and that stuff. But I also lived in Spain in high school, so I, got to college and went on a completely different path. So I, didn't know what I wanted to do. I don't know that I even could have predicted that I would end up writing about politics or working to take down Confederate monuments. I think that sometimes you can follow a pretty circuitous path and end up where you need to be.
Well, speaking of that, so many students at John Jay really use their time here to figure out how their skills and their interests tie together with the fights for justice they want to participate in. So do you have any advice for someone just starting out on this process? How did you figure out which of your talents fit with which of your goals?
So I guess my advice would be just take all the things, like anything that excites you, take it. This kind of goes against sort of orthodoxy, I think, sometimes when we're talking to young people, but like, again, you don't have to know exactly what you're planning to do unless you specifically want to be pre-med or or you're planning on a very direct path. I think doing all the things that you want to do is great. I knew that I was someone who loved writing and that I was creative as a kid, and I was interested in politics, but not to the degree that I became until later. So I knew that writing was something that I wanted to do, but I don't know that you always know how to get into something like that. It feels very daunting, I think, to sort of enter that realm. My first job out of college was a music writer. By the time I got to the end of college, I realized that was what I wanted to do. And I managed to get a job at a startup as a music writer, writing about punk rock, funnily enough. But I spent a lot of time doing lots of stuff. I wrote cable news. I was a speechwriter for a New York City commissioner for a couple of years. I did communications for another New York State agency. I did documentary outreach. I mean, what was central in all that stuff is that I was writing in every single capacity, right? And I just wanted to do that more substantively. And so I think I sort of figured out that, I felt like I had a voice and I had these thoughts about politics. And that was, it made sense for me to, instead of just writing these things down for myself, which I often found myself doing, to sort of merge those things. So I think it's just like, what are you passionate about? And what do you feel like is the easiest route for you to kind of elevate that thing, right? And I think that's different for everyone, but you get a sense of it as you're kind of working toward it.
What changed? You said that you only got interested in politics at a certain point.
Oh gosh, a few things changed. I think I just became much more attuned. I think as just like out in the world, you become, for me, just as a person of color and a woman, and specifically a Black person, I think you become much more aware of what that means, like what your existence as an embodied person means about how you navigate the world in a way that you don't necessarily realize when you're younger. I think that made me much more aware of how politics affected me personally, and that it wasn't sort of that all these things have real life impact for people, right? And so while I think that in the one sense it's sort of I'd almost call it vaguely selfish, and that the route to that learning that, or the route to that interest, was looking at the way that it affected me. That also meant that I started to get really interested in how other marginalized populations were affected, and also how that was treated in media, right? Because I was always doing, sometimes I was doing press and jobs before I became a full-time journalist. And so I started to much more critically sort of read what I was taking in. And I became really hyper aware of what story wasn't there, right? What story wasn't being told, what blinders were on, what gets left out. I think what gets left out is sometimes as important as what's left in. Why we choose to leave certain things in, whose accounts matter, who's allowed to be a victim, who is perpetually the perpetrator, who is, so all those things I think made me really much more sort of a critic of media, which made me want to enter it all the more.
So I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions about your writing, which is fascinating. But first, I wanted to ask, because you've also used visual arts as a tool for justice. So could you talk a little bit more about your experience with that, including with the Theater of the Resist?
Yeah. So again, there's a part of me that's very much a music nerd, and I was helping a friend who worked at the Met with brainstorming some stuff that they could do as this program, and just sort of arty stuff that I thought was germane to what they were working on. And then we decided that it needed actually to be a larger program. And this is in 2017. So we're talking basically months after Donald Trump was elected, when certainly I was feeling very hyper aware of part of the population that had been emboldened to sort of say and do whatever they wanted. I had been writing about that stuff. There was just this much more sort of visible and overt tide of racism and misogyny and xenophobia, and what felt like an escalation in exclusion and erasure. And so this was a way to particularly spotlight artists who were always sort of working on that, who had already been doing work that was kind of addressing those issues, people who were sometimes working on the margins, but were highlighting issues and pushing back on a lot of what, not that necessarily, Trump certainly didn't invent these things, but which felt a lot more palpable and tangible when he came into office. And the feedback from the series that we got was really, for me, was really powerful. I was kind of amazed the way that, people would come up to me after shows and say that watching a performer had informed their thinking on something. We tried to do a really inclusive program. So, that it made me realize, I think we sort of knew this going in, but it really drove home for me how resonant art is, and the way that it has the power to sort of impact and shift conversations in ways that sometimes when you are even just writing an article or talking, people's eyes glaze over, right? There's a different way that people engage with that. And I also, as on my path there, I had worked as an outreach director for social change documentary films, focused on things like marriage equality or public education. So I knew that there was a way that audiences would engage with stuff. I mean, we literally, because we had to do metrics on some of this stuff, we would poll people before a screening and poll them after and see how much they moved. So, that really let me know that people can really take things in and it can impact their thinking. And I also had been affected by art that I'd seen, right? Or art that informs. So that was another thing that got folded into the work that the Make It Right project is doing. One of the things that was really catalytic in the work that we were doing, and why I initially, when we kicked off in June 2018, that we were doing so much work in Chapel Hill, is because Maya Little, who is a student there, who was kind of led or galvanized, I think, people in a lot of ways around taking down the Confederate monument on campus that had been called Silent Sam. She took part in this art protest that was basically, she mixed red paint with blood and poured it on the statue, while the words of Julian Carr, who was the person who did the initial dedication, and said a lot of really hateful things that made very clear why that statue was there. That was such a huge part of what got people's eyes on this statue. It's a huge part of why it came down, right? People have been trying to take this statue down since, you can trace it back to a letter that a student sent in the 60s. So it just, the sense of what art, the kind of political mountains that art can move, has really struck me. And I feel like it's been interwoven with any sort of work that I've done on social issues whenever it can be. And working with artists is always really gratifying.
The center's last speaker, Bianca Zunis, is a cartoonist, and she gave a talk about cartooning for social justice and said very similar things about cartooning being a form of art that gets people's resistance down, and then you can communicate new ideas.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like art opens up a space for things to happen that don't get opened up. Like, there's something really powerful about a thing that's communicated by a dance performance that you may not even be aware is happening, but that engages you in this very different sort of visceral way, right? That if you ask someone to sit through a 2-hour lecture. So that's, it's amazing the power of art.
Well, and I think that's the power that these Confederate monuments are themselves tapping into, right? They
Right.
are very evocative and emotive, and were erected to convince their audience through these sort of sub-rational, subconscious means of this really hateful ideology. So it's interesting to think about using art to fight that type of power of art. So how did you come to be interested in American monuments, given, there's so many gaps between, say, your experience and how you see that experience portrayed in media, or so many injustices? So how did you come to this focus on statues?
So I was already doing, I'd been a freelance journalist, and then I was also a senior writer. At a certain point, I landed as a senior writer and an editor at a progressive news site, that ended up having a shakeup. A lot of my writing was focused on gender and race, often at the intersection of those things. It made me hyper aware of kind of the blind spots in so many newsrooms. So I was thinking specifically, sort of, as you very often are, if you're a person of color, or a woman of any race, about what is getting missed, which those aren't just lenses that you take off, right? They start to become sort of like the critical lens that you're using on the world all the time. So I was already doing that work, and I'd done some writing about Confederate monuments. I'm originally from the South. I grew up in Georgia, and when I was a kid in Georgia, the state flag was essentially one great big Confederate flag. That didn't change till I was in college. So that weird tension of who we say we are and what we do, was something I was already thinking a lot about. Also, the site that I was working at as an writer and editor had a bit of a shakeup, and the board asked me what I was interested in doing. And it was kind of on the heels of Charlottesville, the white supremacist march, that specifically related to this idea that neo-Nazis were going to descend on this town, and protect the Confederate monuments that were there. That had just happened a few months prior. And so I was thinking a lot about Confederate monuments, and it seemed like there was the potential to actually move the needle on this. There were people that were doing work on the issue. There was already the Taken Down NOLA stuff had already happened. And I was kind of impressed with what they'd been able to do, but there wasn't any national network, right? That, and the work around taking down Confederate monuments often tends to be very localized because of statutes and, all the things that go into taking them down. But it seemed really like there was a need for the connective tissue between groups, and that they would be working in their separate ways, but we could be sort of elevating the work that they were doing through this media project. And so I was led to that partially through just like my personal interest in Confederate monuments and the timing of it. And also just, I've always thought that, we spend a lot of time in this country talking about how we want to reckon with race. We are always aspiring in good faith or not, very often in bad faith, but aspiring toward a colorblind society. That rhetoric gets used a lot. And I think that Confederate monuments are the lowest hanging fruit. If that's our actual goal. So taking them down not only seemed like something that there was the possibility to make some actual progress on, but it seemed like if we were going to do anything close to what we on a national level say that we're actually interested in doing in terms of dealing with our racial past, dealing with white racist terror, that there would be some sort of a response to this. And it also, because Charlottesville had happened relatively recently, the conversation had started to shift a bit. It felt a little less disingenuous than the one we'd been having previously about what these symbols were, what their history was, what they meant, and the way that they continued to function in the public spaces they existed in.
Do you still think that monuments are low-hanging fruit, because it seems that they've been defended, sometimes literally even to the death?
I think they're low-hanging fruit in the sense that if, in terms of matching our rhetoric and our aspirations to our actual goals and who we actually are. I mean, if our goal is to live in a raceless society or to have racial equity, certainly taking down the most tangible elements of racial terror should be, I'm not saying it is, but it should be easy. So it's also a really useful way of, I think, pointing out the massive gulf between who we say we are and who we are in practice.
It's like they're canaries in the coal mine too, like a diagnostic test for, do we actually mean what we say we mean? So
Yeah.
as you've been over the years working on monuments, what are some things that you've learned that you think not enough people know about?
So I know we're going to talk a little bit later about the philosophy of monuments, or I am, so I'm not going to get quite into right now why monumentalization happens in this country. But I do think that thinking specifically of Confederate monuments, there were just a few things I wanted to note, because sometimes I'm so immersed in this stuff, I forget that there are lots of the details that get left out, and people are still surprised by things I tell them, because I swim and a fish doesn't know it's in water, right? So you were mentioning the number of statues that have gone up and come down, and I wanted to just look at the latest numbers. And I'm always sort of stunned by the SPLC's estimates, because when I first started looking at their numbers, when they first started tracking them around the country in 2016, the Who's Heritage report, they estimated there were 1,500, right? And then 2 years later, they put up an update, and that number had gone to 1,700, because tracking them meant that we were identifying things that we didn't know existed before. As of February this year, the number is 2,100 roughly. So it's just interesting to me that we're traveling in what I think is the wrong direction, but at least we're identifying these statues. And that includes statues, all kinds of markers, school names, town names, Confederate celebrations, and and Army bases, right? Because there's 10 Army bases that are named for Confederates. The people who literally fought against the US Army were honored with military base names. Most of the statues, because of those 2,100 markers, 704 are actual statues, meaning tangible monuments. Most of them are in the Confederacy or the former Confederacy, but there are plenty of them that are outside of the South, right? There's one in Philadelphia. I'm always stunned that there's one on the south side of Chicago, which is an historically Black neighborhood that stands literally like it casts its shadow on the grave of Ida B. Wells, which is just amazing to me. Until recently, there were Confederate statues in California. There's one in Arlington Cemetery, which is massive, that the UDC put there. They did an amazing job of carrying out the message of the lost cause and white supremacy, cast in literal stone and bronze.
That one has quite the imagery.
Yeah, it's amazing. It includes a Black woman who is clearly an enslaved Black woman, holding a child and crying as a white Confederate leaves for war. It's a sight to be seen. But I think just the indication that we talk about Confederate monuments and the former Confederacy as if it was confined to these 11 contiguous states. And the Confederacy was an ideology, right, that went far beyond the borders of those states. Since George Floyd was killed, 168 markers have been taken down, and 94 of those are actual monuments, which is a pretty huge deal. I think in the years prior to that, between 2015, when the Charleston massacre happened, and George Floyd's murder in May 2020, half that had been removed over that period. So it really kind of shifted the way that we talk about these things. I don't know that most people are aware that we have loyal slave monuments, which is what they're called. They're faithful slave monuments, which I think actually do the best job of spelling out exactly what Confederate monuments mean. They don't kind of bother with simple symbols. They tend to be actual sort of hyper simple slates of granite that have etched on their face words glorifying and lauding enslaved folks for their loyalty. Which, it feels like they just cut to the point. There was a Jefferson Davis highway. And then I don't know that most people know that they're still going up. I mean, we have groups like the Sons of Confederate Veterans that, sometimes they have to keep it to their own private lands, but they are working very hard to continue to put up Confederate monuments. And also, the UDC, although they spend a lot of time pretending to be a group of nice Southern ladies who meet to have tea, they are very active in making sure the Confederate monuments stay up. They often weaponize the courts in their fight, which makes them, they're still shaping our political and social landscape. So those are some of the things. I mean, there are just some offhand sort of facts that I think are really fascinating. The UDC put up a Confederate marker that literally was for the Klan, like it was an ode to the Klan in Concord, North Carolina. If there's any question about what the group was ever committed to, that sort of answers it. And also the fact that in 1923, they successfully lobbied the US Senate to build a monument, quote unquote, in memory of the faithful mammies of the South, which got as far as the US Senate, and there was actually money earmarked for it, but it died in the House. So just that these things, I guess, are still standing and that they continue to do precisely what they are there to do, which is, to race the space that they're in, and to convey the kind of post-Civil War message of intimidation and harassment to Black folks who were being reminded not to freely, free Black folks who were emancipated, who were being reminded not to leave their lane. And also the fact that so many of these are on the grounds of state houses or courthouses, because they were very careful to put them into centers of power so that Black folks would recognize that those institutions were not there to serve them.
So, especially given the really powerful association between these monuments and the solidification of systematic racism in the US, now that we're in this moment of possible opportunity to remove these monuments, what do you think should be done with removed monuments? Relocated, museums, melted down, artistic interventions? What do you think?
Made into dust and sprinkled over the ocean. I actually don't feel that way. I feel like I mean, look, the latest number is we have 704 of them. I I do think it's useful for some of them to be preserved. I don't think we need to preserve 700 of them. It feels like at a certain point you get the point, but in a very different way than having them in our public squares. Um, I think of museums as inherently, um, they add contextualization in a way that you can't do with putting up a video on site. There's something very different about that. So I think it would be useful to have some of them go into museums. The sad thing is, I feel like we could have been having this conversation the whole time, right? Unfortunately, we've spent so much time debating whether or not they should come down, and that's still a conversation that's ongoing. We haven't gotten the chance to think about like post-removal protocols, right? Which I think would be really interesting. I've been very fascinated by what happens with the plinths when a monument is removed, right? Or just the way that some of the defaced monuments, I mean, defacement is a form of protest, right? And the way that they transform these monuments and what it would mean to leave the monument standing that way. And Jelaine Schmidt, who I think we both know, who is a activist in Charlottesville, we were talking a few months ago and she mentioned Michael Tosick, who talked about how defacement and iconoclasm in general is a way of kind of telling the world an open secret, right? So this secret that we've kept under wraps about what these statues actually stand for, defacement kind of reveals that. And so I also think that's a really fascinating way to deal with some of them that are still standing that are covered in, say, graffiti or, that's the way that the protests happen with them. I'm hoping that we can talk about post-removal protocols aside from the few, and I don't think, again, that we need to have hundreds of them in museums, but I think it would be great if we were having a conversation about whether or not we would put them in parks, for example, right? Like, I mean, I know there's Memento Park in Lithuania where or Grūdės Park is in Lithuania, where they leave the statues in this park and they're subject to the weather and just natural erosion. I think there's something really beautiful about that. If people want to visit them, they're all on one site. That conveys something very specific about the meaning of them. I would love for us to have those kinds of conversations, but we haven't. So, my idea is just that we preserve some of them, but we think of really creative ways and artistic ways even of dealing with the others. I think, grinding them all down to salt, maybe not, some of them maybe, but like, I think there's other uses that could be much more powerful in terms of what they say about what they were and what they were put there for, and how we've changed our minds about what they are and what they should be and where they should be.
I also have been reading Michael Tosick, who's a anthropological theorist, his work, especially this book, Defacement, and it is completely fascinating for thinking about statues because he says that if there's a monument that represents a public secret, something that we don't want to acknowledge about our past, then just removing it does nothing to change the secret. You need to transform it in some way in an action that matches the fascination and mystery, more or less, of the secret.
Yeah.
So I really do agree that there is a lot of room for transformative practice instead of just removing these, whether it's to store them away safely or grind them into dust. Although it is tempting to grind some.
And it would be really fascinating to have folks like you and historians and, to have this conversation about what we should do, right? To have sort of a conversation, and maybe it would depend community by community, like what we would take them down off these sites or in these spaces or these ways in which they, so there aren't these venerated statues, but just to have a brain trust of folks thinking about like how we can transform that, I think would be really interesting.
And I think precisely it is something that needs to be discussed community by community, because it is so hyperlocal what this
Yeah.
monument has meant to this community, what it means now. But I find that when people have these debates, they tend to immediately go to this very high theoretical abstract level of, oh, taking down monument erases history, or no, this monument erased history when it went up. So where do you fall on these debates about the effect of taking down a monument?
One, I always think it's really funny how everyone becomes like an art historian or a monument preservationist when we start talking about this stuff. And I would be very curious if the people who are hardcore advocates for keeping them up, who say that it's erasing history, who say it's heritage, not hate, if they would be opposed to, after the Declaration of Independence was read in 1776, a mob of American colonists pulled down a statue of King George III. Like, would they be interested in having that statue put back up? I would bet that they wouldn't. But also the idea that history is inscribed in monuments is absurd to me. I think those people's minds are going to be blown when they learn about libraries. Um, I think that I think again, this relates to how disingenuous I think the debate is. The reason why these markers were put up was for two reasons. One, they were put there to harass and intimidate Black folks. They were a way of reifying white power. They were literal, tangible parts of a campaign of white terror. And also, they were there to reinscribe history. I mean, they were really supposed to make honorable people out of people who had fought for a completely dishonorable cause. So this idea that we would leave up these figures that continue to romanticize the brutality of slavery and downplay, the reality of why the Civil War happened, they perpetuate an historical lie. I do not believe that you can believe in historical truth and accuracy and support these monuments. I also think that they are threats to public safety very often. They are sites in many of the activists that I've worked with, especially through the Make It Right project. They are rallying points for people who are very dangerous. White supremacists literally rally at these sites, right? So they become threats to public safety. They also erase Black folks completely. I mean, under the best of circumstances, let's say that the UDC argued that they wanted to put up more statues. They did want to put up statues to Black folks, but from the same era. There are a number of Black folks that could be honored. It is not accidental that they did not put up statues to any of those folks. So it's a highly selective retelling of history. And because I think that they continue to race the spaces that they're in. I think there is a discomfort for me when I'm in a space and there is someone whose primary contribution to history is that they fought for the perpetual enslavement of Black folks in that space, right? That says something to me about the priorities of where I am and what the space that I'm in and the people that live around it, what they feel about that space and how important it is for them to be welcoming to everyone. And, I've been reading lately about the epistemology of ignorance, which Charles Mills writes about specifically. He writes about the contract with whiteness, but he also, as sort of like a subgenre of that, writes about white ignorance. And I feel like, we're seeing this debate right now where particularly white conservatives are up in arms about things like critical race theory, about the 1619 Project. So there's real opposition to the unvarnished telling of history. And these statues to me are that kind of resistance to history actually made tangible. And for all those reasons, it just seems very clear to me that taking them down acts as a corrective.
And they're not only resistance to history made tangible at the time, but they continue to be these tools of resistance to
Right.
history, I think, like perpetrating this view that leaves out so many people.
And that's the intention, right? Like they were put there, we put up we monumentalize things for ourselves, but also to ensure that the message that we are hoping to convey is beaconed into the future. So that message, that white supremacist message, that idea that somehow there was a period when Black folks were most content with their subjugation, the idea that the fight for Black chattel slavery and perpetuity was an honorable fight, the idea that slavery wasn't so bad anyway, the entire myth of the lost cause, which is a violent white supremacist myth, continues to be perpetuated by these statues. And I don't ever want to have to explain, although I have had to before, to a Black child why we decided to put someone whose primary contribution to history is that they fought for their enslavement, why that's standing in a park in the center of town.
So speaking of the effect of statues on their place, a long two-part question for you. So John Jay College is named for John Jay, who, among other achievements, also owned enslaved people. And our campus has a bronze statue of him, only about 6 years old, which is placed in the main atrium. So some members of our community think this statue should remain up to celebrate his accomplishments, to have him act as an inspiration for our students, and others think that, and no one's like, let's all forget about the slavery thing, but they say, let's maybe place some signage to discuss his role in slavery. Other people think it should be removed entirely or moved to a less prominent location on campus, or maybe should be modified by artists and students. So given your research, I guess just what advice would you have for us as a community to come to a decision about this monument? Have you seen examples of these type of debates going very wrong versus very right? What's the difference? And what advice can you give for how to discuss a statue like this one, where the admirable and abhorrent aspects of a history are so mixed together?
So this question really was very interesting to me, just on a side note, because I can't think of, I don't think there's a middle ground that I've ever seen people come to. I think the closest that I've seen is these long drawn out processes where there's a commission that forms, and then finally sort of the most milquetoasty version of a conclusion is that they are going to put up signage around it. That happened in a lot of, when we initially started the Make It Right project in 2018, I feel like that was a conclusion that people came to. It was a way of sort of riding the fence and trying to please everyone. And I don't think that it worked out. And most of those where they voted to have, say, signage put up around the statue, that inevitably never happened. Or people were very unhappy with the signage because there's only so much you can say on a plaque. It's difficult for me to provide any kind of advice on this, because the only way I've ever seen this go and seen it work well is where it ultimately gets taken, like the sort of trying to ride the middle doesn't ever seem to work for me. Taking the statue down and then perhaps deciding if you're going to put it in. I mean, I'm interested to see where the discussion goes in terms of where it's placed on campus. That I think is a much more interesting discussion, but the idea of leaving it there and trying to come to something that will make everyone happy feels very impossible with something like a Confederate statue, which is so bound up in people's identities and ideas about themselves. I just that just hasn't been my experience on working on them. I'm sorry, that's not a great answer, but it's kind of where I ended up after doing that work for 3 years.
No, I think that is a good answer, because precisely because people think that the answers to these questions should be simple. Like, here's
Yeah.
what we do. And if your advice is it's going to be a hard process and it's going to take a while, that's a good data point. And especially the idea that attempts at compromise haven't really worked. Which I agree with. I've done a lot of research on signage, effects of signage. People don't actually read the signage, et cetera. So that doesn't.
Or people read the signage and are very unhappy with, I mean, just the back and forth on what a sign is going to say. And there's all these political considerations that some people are going to be very unhappy with. And I do think it's very hard to put the full story on. I mean, that's why, again, there's part of me really likes the idea of some of these things being in museums. I just think there's so much more space, and it's just a different way you can communicate what this thing was and its significance. Yeah, there's no middle to me.
So, as I hope will happen for our listeners, if any students are inspired by listening to this conversation to start following your work, what do you hope they'll take from your writing, and or do you have any greatest hits to recommend, or ways to follow you?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Callie Holloway FTW. But the thing that I guess I would hope they take from my writing is I think that right now the world can feel like a really dark and difficult and chaotic and particularly sort of saddening place. And um, I've been writing about these topics for years now, and I don't every day feel great about the state that we're in or our trajectory or what the future looks like. Um, but I keep doing it because obviously, even on the days when I feel like I don't have any hope about us doing better or being better, there's some part of me that thinks that that's not actually true, right? That there is a chance for us to change and to commit to what we say is our ideals, and for us to be um, just generally better, I guess. And I hope that, one, I inform people about issues maybe they aren't aware of. I hope, a thing that I try to do with my work a lot is to historicize things. I think we often have a conversation in this country where we're perpetually baffled about how this is happening. It's like, well, there we had a whole historical arc that led us here. So historicizing and contextualizing things. Um, I hope that that provides some insight, and I hope that reading about some of this stuff motivates people to care, and maybe some of these students who already care will be interested in writing about them or getting involved or seeking out ways that they can do more, especially once they I know it's hard when you when you're done with college to kind of, we were talking about this earlier, how do you apply all the stuff that you are really interested in, especially if you're interested in social justice, and how do you elevate those issues and make your voice heard. But there are ways to do it, and I do these conferences or talking to students or presentations, and I'm constantly astounded by kind of the energy and insight that students have. Like, I feel like they just are leaps and bounds above where I was at that point, right? They're so much more insightful. They've read so much more. They've thought so much more. They're just at a different place. I mean, they actually make me think all the time about what my framing should be, about, you know, uh, how to speak to my audience in a way that will feel inviting or will feel new and won't be something that they've read a million times. So I hope that they are inspired, and that they know that they can be involved in anything that they put their minds to, and as difficult as it seems from the outside, and as cynical making as it can feel. there are moments of joy in the work, and that there are moments where change happens and you're astounded by the fact that you in some way were part of it.
Well, I hope many such features are in our students. And yeah, I have to say, especially during this recent year, I've been completely astounded by the leadership of our students in many ways and in many areas of activism. So thank you again so much for joining us. I could only wish it was in person, but maybe someday in the future.
Yeah,
And I encourage everyone to follow your work. Thank you.
thank you. Thanks for having me.